It was a day like any other when he set out into the desert, a place known for its harshness, its desolation, and its secrets. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would find, a discovery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, the wilderness, and the strange mysteries of nature. The sun hung high in the sky, the relentless heat beating down on the barren landscape. For miles, there was nothing but sand, rock, and the distant, wavering horizon. The man, a seasoned traveler, had spent years navigating this unforgiving terrain, yet there was something about today that felt different. As the hours passed and the landscape blurred together, he began to feel an uneasy stillness in the air, a quiet that pressed against him like an unseen force. He paused, his instincts telling him to take notice, but it wasn't until the shimmer of something unusual caught his eye that he understood why. At first, it looked like a mirage. Something out of place, a trick of the light, perhaps. But as he squinted into the vast emptiness, he saw it more clearly. A figure, a shape moving slowly across the horizon. It didn't belong here. In the middle of this lifeless desert, there should have been no sign of life, especially not a creature so magnificent, so out of place. A horse. But this wasn't just any horse. It was wild, its coat matted with dirt and sweat, its ribs visible beneath the thin layer of skin, but its eyes were wide, bright, and full of something that could only be described as desperation. The man couldn't believe it at first. How could a horse, such a powerful, majestic animal, end up stranded in a place like this? The desert had no mercy, no compassion for the weak. He knew that. For a moment, he stood frozen, his heart racing as he processed what he was seeing. Then, instincts took over. He moved forward, his steps slow and deliberate, trying to approach without startling the animal. His mind raced with questions. How had it gotten here? Was it lost? Was it running from something? Every answer seemed impossible, yet the horse was undeniably real, and it needed help. As he neared, the horse didn't run. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging his presence, as if it had given up, resigned to whatever fate the desert had in store. The man took another step closer, his hands shaking now not from fear, but from the sheer strangeness of the situation. This wasn't supposed to happen. There was no explanation, no reason for the horse to be here, and yet there it was, staring at him with eyes full of silent pleading. The man reached out a hand, and the horse, after a long moment of hesitation, took a small, cautious step forward. Their eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. The man knew this animal was in trouble, he could feel it in his bones. But he also knew that the desert was unforgiving. There was little chance of survival out here without help. Without water. Without shelter. He had to make a decision. He couldn't just leave it here. Not like this. But as he moved to approach the horse, something shifted in the air. A cold wind whipped through the desert, and in that instant, the horse's ears flicked, its body tensing. Something was coming. The man felt a sudden, sharp sense of urgency. He needed to act quickly, but his mind was clouded with doubt and fear. What if he wasn't prepared for what lay ahead? What if rescuing the horse meant he would be walking into something far more dangerous than he could handle? Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as though the earth itself was reacting to the presence of the horse. The air grew heavier, the weight of the silence pressing in around him. A sound, distant but unmistakable, echoed through the desert, a low, guttural growl. It was a sound that didn't belong. It was an animal's warning, a challenge from somewhere deep within the wilderness. The man's heart skipped a beat. He had heard stories of things that roamed the desert, unseen and untold. Creatures that were as ancient as the land itself. But those were just stories, right? Folklore. Myths. The harsh reality of the desert didn't allow for such fantasies. And yet, the growl persisted, growing louder, closer, His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave the horse behind and retreat to safety. But how could he? The animal had trusted him. The bond between them, fragile yet undeniable, anchored him to the spot. He couldn't abandon it now. The horse, sensing the change in the air, let out a soft whinny, its ears flicking nervously. The man glanced around, his pulse quickening. What was out there? What was waiting for them in the shadows of the desert? He made his decision. There was no turning back. But as he took a step forward, a sharp pain shot through his leg. His foot had caught on something in the sand. He stumbled, caught off guard, and looked down. There, half buried beneath the surface, was something metallic. A relic, perhaps. Or was it something more? Something that had been waiting, just below the surface, for years, for decades, waiting for someone to find it. He reached down to uncover it, his fingers trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What he uncovered would change everything. But as his hand gripped the object, the ground beneath him trembled. The growl became deafening, and a shadow swept over him, blocking out the sun. The horse reared up, its hooves striking the sand, and the man's heart raced as the sound of claws scraping against stone grew louder. In that moment, as the desert seemed to come alive around him, he realized one terrifying truth: he had no idea what he had just uncovered, or what was coming for them. The horse wasn't the only thing that needed saving. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he yanked his hand away from the object in the sand, the metallic surface glinting in the fading light of the sun. His fingers burned with a strange energy, the air around him thickening with each passing second. He didn't have to look up to know the horse had noticed it too, the sudden shift in the air, the way its nostrils flared, and its tense, wide-eyed gaze. It was as if the animal had sensed something ancient, something old that had been buried for far too long. The desert had a way of hiding things, secrets that people had long forgotten, buried beneath its vast, endless stretches of sand. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. What had he just uncovered? It wasn't just some forgotten relic of the past, no. This felt different. It felt like something important, something that shouldn't be touched, yet here he was, with his hand still hovering over it, half expecting the ground to swallow it back up again. The growl continued, its low, rumbling growl growing closer, the source of it still unknown. The air seemed to vibrate with tension, and the weight of the desert's secrets pressed in on him from every side. The horse's hooves dug into the sand as it pawed nervously, and the man realized he was no longer alone in this moment. He could feel the eyes of something watching him, something unseen, something that had been waiting for him to uncover what he had just found. The tension in the air was unbearable. The man's instincts screamed at him to run, to leave it all behind and escape into the distance, but his body refused to move. Something deeper than fear held him there. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He had to focus. The object beneath him felt like it was pulsing, as if it were alive in some way, like it was calling out to him, urging him to understand its significance. He glanced back down at it, a small, rusted metal box, partially buried in the sand. It was nondescript, unassuming in appearance, but there was an undeniable energy emanating from it, something that tugged at his very core. With trembling hands, he brushed more sand away from the box, revealing more of its shape. It was rectangular, roughly the size of a small chest, and its surface was etched with symbols, faint and worn by time. The markings were unlike anything he had ever seen, a language so ancient that it felt out of place even in the vast, ageless desert. The box itself seemed to hum with an eerie resonance, a sound just below the threshold of hearing, as if it had been waiting for someone to unlock it. He reached out again, his fingers hovering above the symbols. The growl in the distance was louder now, closer. It was no longer just an ominous sound in the background, it was a promise. A warning. Something was out there, something that didn't belong to this world, and the man knew that the moment he touched that box, everything would change. But curiosity got the best of him. He couldn't stop himself. His fingers brushed against the metal, and a jolt of energy shot through his body. It wasn't physical pain, but something far more unsettling, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The growl ceased, and for a brief moment, the world went still. The wind died down. The desert, once alive with the sounds of creatures and the shifting of the earth, was eerily silent. And then, with a suddenness that took him by surprise, the box clicked. It opened. The lid of the metal box lifted with a soft, almost imperceptible sound, revealing a dark, hollow interior. For a moment, the man's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the contents of the box. It wasn't what he expected, not treasure, not ancient artifacts, but something far more unsettling. A small, tattered piece of cloth, stained with something dark. It looked like an old banner or flag, its fabric worn and faded from age, but its intricate design was still visible, the symbols matching those etched into the metal of the box. The man recoiled instinctively. This was not a relic of some ancient civilization, it felt more like something that had been buried intentionally, something meant to be hidden for a reason. He felt a chill run down his spine as he slowly pulled the cloth from the box. As his fingers brushed against the fabric, a vision flashed before his eyes, a strange, fleeting image, a glimpse into something beyond this world. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing at the edge of a vast, endless desert. The figure was tall, its features obscured, but there was something about it, something malevolent that made the air around it shimmer with unnatural heat. The desert seemed to bend and warp around the figure, as if it had the power to shape the very land itself. And in the distance, just beyond the figure, the man saw a horse. The vision vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only the weight of the cloth in his hands. His heart raced, his breast shallow, as he looked at the cloth again. The horse from the vision was the same as the one standing before him now. It was as though the desert itself was playing tricks on his mind, weaving a tale of some forgotten prophecy or curse that had somehow drawn him into its web. The sound of the growl returned, louder and closer this time. The man's eyes snapped up, his gaze darting around the desert, searching for the source of the sound. But the landscape was still and empty, the horizon stretching endlessly before him. The horse snorted, its body tense, its ears flicking back and forth as it too seemed to sense the approaching danger. And then, the sand beneath their feet began to tremble. The man's heart skipped a beat. The ground was shifting, the desert coming alive around him. He had no idea what he had just uncovered, but he could feel the power of it coursing through him, the very land responding to its presence. The tension in the air was suffocating, the growl now joined by other, more unsettling sounds, scraping, shifting, the sound of something moving beneath the surface. Something large. Something ancient. He staggered back, clutching the cloth tightly in his hands. The desert had always been a place of death, of danger, but this was something else. The horse reared, its hooves striking the air in panic. The man could feel it too now, the sense that something was coming, something that would destroy everything in its path. He had to leave. He had to get out of there. But the desert wouldn't let him. Suddenly, from beneath the sand, a dark shape emerged, towering over him. It was massive, like a shadow, its form shifting and swirling in the air. The horse bolted, its hooves kicking up sand as it raced toward the horizon. But the man could only stand there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing with fear and disbelief. What was it? What was coming for him? The creature from beneath the sand emerged fully now, its massive, clawed feet sinking into the earth as it took shape. It wasn't like any animal he had ever seen, no, this was something else entirely. Something older. Something dangerous. The man's throat tightened as he stared at the creature, his mind struggling to comprehend what it was. And then, in the midst of the chaos, as the creature loomed closer, the man realized something. The horse had not been the only one calling out for help. The desert had been waiting for him, too. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the air grew heavy with a strange, almost tangible sense of dread. The creature that had risen from the sand was unlike anything he had ever imagined. It moved like a living shadow, a dark silhouette that seemed to distort the very world around it. Its massive claws scraped against the earth, sending up a trail of dust that clouded the air. The man stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. But there was no rational explanation. The creature's eyes glowed, faintly at first, like two burning embers in the dark, but as it focused on him, the glow grew brighter, more intense. It was as if it could see right through him, as though it could read his very soul. The man froze, paralyzed by a mix of fear and awe. Every instinct told him to run, to flee from this thing, but his legs wouldn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the creature, drawn to it as if it were some kind of magnet, some primal force beyond his control. The horse, too, had sensed it. Its hooves drummed against the earth in a frantic, panicked rhythm as it darted back and forth, unsure of where to go, desperate to escape the growing presence. The creature, however, didn't seem to care for the horse's movements. Its focus remained entirely on the man, its shadowy form rippling as it advanced. With each step it took, the air seemed to warp and shift, as though the very fabric of reality was bending under its weight. The man's breath came in shallow gasps, his throat tight. The cloth in his hands, the one he had found buried beneath the sand, was still clutched tightly in his fingers. He could feel its weight, its presence, as though it too were connected to this thing that loomed before him. It was impossible to ignore the connection. He could feel it in his bones, a pull that went beyond anything logical, beyond any kind of explanation. But what was it? What had he uncovered? In the distance, the growl he had heard earlier returned, now accompanied by a chorus of other strange sounds. There was no mistaking it now, there was something out there, moving through the sand, closing in. The man's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of escape, but the desert seemed to close in around him, its vastness turned against him. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The creature paused, its head tilting slightly, as if considering its next move. It wasn't in a rush. No, this was a predator, patient, calculating. The man's mind raced, searching for answers, for any kind of understanding. Was it the cloth? Was it the object he had uncovered that had drawn this creature here? What did it want? And more importantly, why was it fixated on him? Suddenly, a memory flashed through his mind, a vague recollection, like a half-forgotten dream. He had heard stories, old stories, whispered among the few who dared to venture into the desert. Tales of things that lurked beneath the surface, of ancient creatures and forgotten forces that had long since slipped from memory. The desert wasn't just a place of survival, it was a place where the past lived on, waiting to be unearthed. And when that past was disturbed, when the wrong thing was uncovered, it didn't stay buried. But the stories had always been just that, stories. Fables passed down over generations, meant to scare children into staying away from the desert's edge. He had never believed them. Not until now. The creature took another step, and the ground beneath the man's feet seemed to shift, as though the earth itself was moving in response to the beast's presence. The horse reared again, its panicked movements becoming more erratic as it began to move toward the edge of the desert, but the creature didn't follow. It remained focused on the man, its glowing eyes unblinking. And then, as if to add to the growing sense of dread, the man heard another sound. A faint rustling, like something moving beneath the sand, just out of sight. The desert wasn't empty. It was alive. Alive in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. His fingers tightened around the cloth, and once again, the strange pull was there, drawing him closer to the object. The symbols on the fabric seemed to shift and dance in the dim light, as if they were alive themselves. It was as if the desert was responding to it, reacting to the very presence of the cloth. He couldn't explain it, but there was no denying the connection. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp, jagged noise. A sound that made the man's blood run cold, a high-pitched screech that echoed through the desert. It wasn't the creature. No, this was something else entirely. Something new. Something even more terrifying. His eyes widened as he looked to the horizon. From the distance, a series of dark shapes were moving toward him, cutting through the sand like a wave. They were fast, relentless, and there were more of them than he could count. The creatures, whatever they were, moved with terrifying speed, their bodies cloaked in shadow, their forms indistinct. They were drawn to the creature that had risen from the sand, as if it had called them. As if they were its followers, its pack. The man felt his heart drop as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a simple encounter. No. This was something far bigger, something far darker. The desert wasn't just a place of isolation. It was a kingdom, and this creature, this ancient being, was its king. And now, it was looking for its heir. The man's thoughts spun wildly, but one thing became clear: he had unwittingly stepped into a war that had been raging for millennia. The cloth, the symbols, it was all part of something ancient. Something he had never imagined could be real. The horse, too, was a part of it. He had thought it was simply lost in the desert, but it was more than that. It was a messenger, a symbol of what was to come. The creatures were closing in now, their forms taking shape in the dimming light. They were fast, too fast for the man to outrun. He looked around, desperately searching for a way out, but there was nothing. No shelter, no safety. Only the desert, closing in like an unrelenting predator. The tension in the air was suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. Every breath he took felt heavier than the last. He had no idea what would happen next, no idea what he had unleashed, what forces he had disturbed. But one thing was certain: his life, and the fate of this desert, was forever changed. He glanced back at the horse, which had stopped its frantic movements and now stood still, its eyes locked onto the creatures with a quiet understanding. It was as if it knew what was coming, as if it had always known. And then, with a final, piercing growl from the creature at the heart of the desert, the world seemed to explode into motion. The man's fate, the fate of the desert, and the horses, hung in the balance, and the only thing he knew for sure was that nothing would ever be the same again. The creatures surged forward, a shadowy tide of movement, too fast, too relentless. The man could barely see them, their forms shifting through the dim desert light, like smoke, like ghosts. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, too many to count. His heart thudded in his chest as he realized that escape wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. His eyes flicked from the approaching swarm to the creature that had risen from the sand. Its burning eyes never left him, never wavered. It was as if it was waiting for something. Waiting for him. The desert air was thick with the scent of sand and the electric tension that pulsed in every direction. The man's thoughts were a chaotic mess. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he could feel the sweat running down his face, his hands trembling around the cloth, which still seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though it, too, knew what was coming. The ground beneath his feet trembled again, but this time it wasn't the creature, it was something bigger, something deeper. The sand around him began to shift, not in the usual way of desert winds, but in a way that felt alive, as though the earth itself was responding to the call of the shadows. The man's heart skipped a beat as he realized creatures weren't just coming for him. They were coming for the cloth. They were coming for what he had uncovered. The horse, which had once been so frantic, now stood still, its body tense but unmoving, its head low. It was as if the animal had accepted its fate, or perhaps, had been waiting for this moment all along. The man tried to move toward it, but his feet felt as if they were sinking into the sand, as though the desert itself were trying to swallow him whole. From the distance, the creature's screeches grew louder, sharper, echoing off the barren desert landscape. They were closing in, their forms now distinguishable, though just barely. They weren't human, that much was certain. Their bodies were twisted, contorted in unnatural ways, their limbs too long, too thin, their faces nothing more than shadowed masks of hunger. They moved as one, a collective force, like a single organism that could not be stopped. The man's pulse raced. The anticipation of their approach was almost unbearable, the tension thick in the air like a storm about to break. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, to find a way to escape, but his legs refused to obey. The more he tried to move, the more rooted he felt to the spot, as if the desert itself had claimed him, marking him as part of its curse. The creature at the center of it all took another slow, deliberate step toward him, and the sound of its claws dragging through the sand echoed in his mind, amplifying his sense of dread. He glanced down at the cloth in his hands, still trembling, and the symbols seemed to glow faintly, casting an eerie light against the growing darkness. Was this what it had all been leading to? Was this the reason he had found it buried here, in the heart of the desert? It felt like a key, a trigger to something he couldn't yet understand, something ancient and unstoppable. The symbols pulsed again, and he felt a strange pressure in his chest, as if the cloth were drawing him closer to it, as if it wanted him to unlock its secrets. With a sudden, almost instinctual movement, he unfurled the cloth, the fabric catching the wind and snapping in the air. For the briefest of moments, he caught sight of the symbols fully illuminated by the dim light of the desert, and a surge of energy shot through him. The world seemed to shift around him, the desert landscape blurring, as if reality itself was warping under the weight of what he had just uncovered. The creature screeched, a noise that rattled his bones, and the man's body locked in place. He couldn't look away. He couldn't move. A low rumbling sound filled the air, almost like an earthquake, but deeper, more resonant. It was coming from the ground beneath him. The sand began to tremble more violently, and he could feel it through his entire body, like the very earth was coming to life. And then, something beneath the sand began to stir, shifting, rising. A massive, shadowy form slowly emerged, the size of a building, its shape too vague to fully comprehend. The man's heart nearly stopped. It was the source of the growl, the thing he had been hearing all along. This wasn't just a creature, it was something far older, something more powerful than he could have ever imagined. It was the desert itself, alive, waking up from centuries of slumber, and it was angry. The air thickened, the pressure building to an unbearable point. The man felt the cloth in his hands tightening, its power growing stronger with every passing second. The desert, the creatures, the very land was reacting to it, reacting to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence, that the desert had chosen him, for better or worse. The creatures screeched again, now so close he could hear their ragged breathing, feel their rancid, hot breath on the back of his neck. They were ready to strike, ready to tear him apart, but the man couldn't move. The energy that had been building inside him, the connection to the cloth, to the desert, to the creature, it was all too much. He could feel it coursing through him, his body trembling with its power. With a deafening roar, the ground split open beneath him, and the colossal form that had risen from the earth fully emerged. It was massive, its shape twisting and shifting like smoke, like a living shadow that defied all logic. The man could barely comprehend what he was seeing, but he knew it was the end. The end of the desert. The end of everything. And just as the creature's monstrous form loomed over him, ready to strike, the man heard a sound that cut through the chaos, a voice, faint but clear, calling out to him from somewhere deep within the desert. It wasn't a voice of salvation. No, it was a voice of warning, of a truth too terrible to comprehend. The voice whispered only one word: run. But before he could react, before he could even make a move, the world around him exploded into chaos. The voice, though faint, reverberated in his mind, urging him to run. But the man couldn't move. His legs were frozen, his body numb with fear and anticipation. He stared at the creatures that loomed before him. The ground around him trembled with their every movement, the air thick with a foreboding energy. But just as the desert was about to swallow him whole, a strange shift occurred. The monstrous figure that had emerged from the sand seemed to hesitate, its vast shadow wavering for the briefest of moments. Then, something unimaginable happened. The creatures, which had been closing in on him, stopped in their tracks. Their screeches, once deafening, were suddenly silenced, their twisted forms frozen in place. It was as if they had all been struck by a force beyond comprehension, a force that held them in place, paralyzed. The man blinked, his mind racing to make sense of this sudden turn of events. For a moment, the desert was still. Deathly still. Then, just as quickly as the silence had settled, the ground beneath him began to crack, a deep rumble that shook the earth. The sand itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if something deeper, more ancient, was awakening beneath the surface. The creature that had risen from the depths of the desert tilted its head back, letting out a low, guttural sound, part growl, part roar. Its form seemed to shift, becoming less defined, more ethereal, as if it were being pulled between two worlds. The desert was no longer just a place of sand and dust, it was a battleground, a place of ancient, unstoppable forces. The man felt his heart race, his pulse pounding in his ears as he realized something he had missed. The voice, the one that had warned him to run, it wasn't just a warning. It was a signal, a call for help. But from whom? And why? Was the desert, or the creature within it, communicating with him? Or was it something else? In that moment, the symbols on the cloth began to glow with an intensity that nearly blinded him. The fabric burned in his hands, the heat radiating through his skin. The pull of the cloth was stronger now than ever before. It was as though it had a life of its own, drawing him towards something buried deep within the desert's heart. But he knew he couldn't trust it. The creatures, now immobilized, seemed to be waiting for the moment when the cloth's power would reveal its true purpose. But what was that purpose? What was this cloth really meant to unlock? As the man's thoughts raced, the sound of the desert itself began to change. The wind, which had been almost non-existent, started to howl in strange, unnatural patterns. It wasn't a typical desert breeze, it was a sound that vibrated through the air, a rhythm, a chant. The sand shifted in waves, almost as though it were alive, undulating like a massive, shifting organism. Then, as the darkness grew even thicker, a new sound joined the chaos. A low, unsettling hum, coming from deep within the sand. It grew louder with each passing second, a sound so alien that it made his skin crawl. He turned, desperate to understand the source, but there was nothing, just the sand, the creatures, and the shape of the massive being before him. But the hum didn't stop. In fact, it began to grow stronger, more intense. The sound seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the earth, sending tremors through the air. And then, the unimaginable happened. From the center of the desert, a massive crack appeared, stretching across the landscape like a wound, a jagged tear in the earth itself. From this fissure, something began to emerge, something even more terrifying than the creatures that had once surrounded him. It was as if the desert was opening up, revealing something long buried, something powerful, something ancient beyond reckoning. The man's breath caught in his throat. The cloth in his hand seemed to vibrate with energy, pulling him toward the crack, toward the terrible force that was rising from it. The creatures, still frozen in place, began to twitch. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, they began to move again, their bodies contorting and shifting, as if the hum, the cracking of the earth, had woken them. But they weren't the only ones moving. The desert itself seemed to come alive, its sands swirling violently, as though the earth itself had turned against him. The man's mind spun, trying to process what was happening. He had thought the desert was the end of his journey, but now it was clear. It was only the beginning. The force that was rising from the depths of the earth, the power that had awakened, wasn't just for him, it was for everything. The desert, the creatures, the cloth, it was all connected, part of something far larger, far more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. The massive being that had once towered over him was now moving, its shape flickering, growing more solid with each passing second. Its eyes glowed brighter, burning with an intensity that made the air shimmer. The man could feel its gaze, cold, calculating, full of ancient knowledge. It was studying him, waiting for him to make the next move. And then, in a heartbeat, it was as if the desert itself exhaled. The air seemed to crackle with energy as the man was pulled toward the crack in the earth. He could feel the power building, could hear the wind howling louder, the hum intensifying. The creatures that had surrounded him were no longer mere shadows, they were tangible now, their forms solidifying, their eyes fixed on him. Their hunger was palpable. The sand, the creatures, the earth, the cloth, that was all converging. And the man, caught in the center of it all, realized with a terrible clarity that whatever happened next would determine the fate of everything. The desert wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a force with its own rules, its own power. And he had awakened it. He had no choice now but to face it. Whatever came next, whether it was salvation or destruction, he would have to confront it. But the real question was, who would he be after it was over? And more importantly, who or what would be left standing when the dust settled? The desert waited. The ground beneath the man's feet trembled violently as the crack in the desert earth widened, revealing something beyond imagination, a vast, ancient structure buried deep within the sands. It wasn't a natural formation. No, this was something man-made, something old, far older than any civilization he had ever studied. The structure seemed to pulse with energy, as if it were alive, as if it were waiting for him. The massive being, whatever it was, towered above him, now fully revealed, its form shifting between solidity and shadow. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light, as if it could peer into his soul. The hum that had filled the air grew deafening, vibrating in his chest, sending shockwaves through the very air around him. The creatures that had been frozen in place slowly started to move again, but now they were different. Their eyes, once full of primal hunger, were now vacant, as if they had lost their purpose. Their movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if something had taken control of them. The man felt a surge of power as the cloth in his hands pulsed, the symbols glowing brighter, filling the desert with an eerie light. It was as if the cloth had become an anchor, tethering him to whatever force was awakening beneath the sands. He had no choice but to move forward, step by step, toward the massive fissure in the earth. As he approached the edge of the crack, the structure below seemed to come to life, its dark, weathered stones shifting and groaning as if it were slowly awakening from a long slumber. The sand around him swirled, and the temperature seemed to drop dramatically, sending chills down his spine. The desert, once silent and still, now roared with a ferocity that matched the storm that was building in the sky. And then, the unthinkable happened. The massive being that had been looming over him, the one whose form had been so fleeting, so ungraspable, finally spoke. Its voice was not one of a creature, but something ancient, as if it had been etched into the very fabric of time. "You have awakened us," it said, its voice low and resonant. "But now you must pay the price." The man froze, his heart pounding in his chest. What price? What was it asking for? The cloth in his hands seemed to burn with an intensity that left him dizzy, as if it was pulling him deeper into the desert's heart. The glowing symbols shifted, moving faster now, as if they were alive, reacting to the creature's words. The sand at his feet began to crack and shift once more, and a series of sharp, jagged stones rose from the earth like spires, forming a circle around him. The desert itself seemed to be closing in, trapping him within its grasp. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation, and the man knew, deep down, that whatever happened next would change everything. Suddenly, the creature's glowing eyes locked onto his. "You cannot escape," it intoned. "You have already become part of this desert. Your fate is sealed." A wave of dread washed over him, but before he could react, the sand beneath him erupted, sending him tumbling to the ground. The cloth was wrenched from his hands, spinning into the air as the energy from the desert surged around him. His body was lifted, pulled by an invisible force, and the creature's voice boomed again, shaking him to his core. "The cloth was never meant for you. You were chosen to awaken us, but it is not you who will control us." In that moment, everything shifted. The desert itself seemed to roar in fury, the once static creatures now moving as one, their twisted forms converging on him, their eyes glowing with a hunger far deeper than before. But as they closed in, the very ground beneath them began to shake violently, and with a deafening crash, the ancient structure beneath the sand cracked open like a giant egg, releasing a flood of light and energy that poured out across the desert. The creatures howled in pain, retreating into the shadows, their forms disintegrating as the energy from the structure enveloped them. The man was thrown to the ground by the sheer force of the explosion, but he didn't feel the impact. The light was blinding, overpowering, filling every inch of the desert. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving the desert in a heavy, unnatural silence. He lay there for a long moment, disoriented, his body aching. The creatures were gone. The massive being, the one that had towered over him, was nowhere to be seen. The desert, for the first time, was still. The sand, the wind, the heat, they were all eerily quiet. It was as if the world itself had stopped, as if everything had frozen in place. But when he looked down at the cloth, lying next to him in the sand, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a single symbol, burned into the fabric, glowing faintly in the fading light. The same symbol he had seen etched into the stone beneath the desert. The same symbol that had been hidden for so long. And then it hit him, a realization that made his stomach drop. He hadn't just awakened the desert. He hadn't just unleashed an ancient force. He had become part of it. The man's heart pounded as he stood up, his mind racing. The desert wasn't done with him. The creatures weren't gone. They had only retreated, only shifted into the shadows, waiting. Waiting for the right moment. And that moment, he realized with a cold shiver, was fast approaching. Because the desert had no end. The desert had no mercy. It had only one purpose: to consume. And as the wind began to stir again, the man understood that he was no longer just a part of the desert's story. He was the story's end. The desert had claimed him. The air around him felt heavy, thick with the silence that followed the desert's violent upheaval. The once fevered, almost animalistic rhythm of the sandstorms and tremors now seemed to have given way to a strange stillness. But beneath the surface, something still stirred. The man could feel it. The desert wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had accepted him. In its own, incomprehensible way, it had made him part of its story, part of its ancient cycle. And now, it was time to face the consequences. As he stood there, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite capture, a sense of dread settled in his chest. The cloth, still glowing faintly, was no longer just a symbol. It had become something else, a key. A key to something deeper within the desert's forgotten heart. But what? And why him? Why had he been chosen for this strange fate, pulled into the tangled web of forces he didn't understand? He thought back to the voice, the one that had urged him to run in the beginning. Had it been a warning or a plea for help? Or was it something else entirely, a part of the desert, a manifestation of its ancient will? The question lingered in his mind as he slowly turned, trying to make sense of the aftermath. The air around him was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. The sand beneath him, once a chaotic, ever-shifting ocean, had settled into a calmness that unnerved him. He took a tentative step forward, his feet crunching softly against the hardened earth. The remnants of the ancient structure now revealed in its entirety loomed before him. The massive stone pillars, carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with energy, stood like silent sentinels, guarding a hidden truth. What had been buried beneath the desert for centuries? And more importantly, why had it been awakened now? The man felt an impulse, an undeniable pull toward the structure. The glowing cloth in his hand seemed to resonate with the energy of the stones, as if it were meant to be here, in this moment, in this place. He moved toward the center of the ruin, where the earth seemed to cave in slightly, forming a small depression. As he stepped closer, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as though the very structure was alive, responding to his presence. His hand trembled as he reached out, pressing the cloth against the stones. For a moment, nothing happened. The desert remained silent, as if waiting, holding its breath. And then, slowly, the symbols on the cloth began to glow brighter, more intensely, their light spilling out onto the stone's surface beneath him. The desert itself seemed to exhale a long, deep sigh, as if acknowledging the connection, as if something hidden deep within the ruins had been triggered. Suddenly, the earth rumbled beneath his feet. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, building in intensity. The stone pillars began to shift, sliding apart like massive doors, revealing a deep, dark passage below. The man's heart raced as the light from the cloth illuminated the passageway. There was no turning back now. He had awoken something far beyond his understanding, and now he had to face it. With no other choice, he stepped into the dark passage, the glow from the cloth casting long shadows on the walls around him. As he descended deeper into the earth, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. His breath was shallow, his mind racing with questions that he couldn't answer. What lay at the end of this path? What had he truly uncovered? The passage twisted and turned, narrowing as he moved further down, until finally, he reached a vast chamber. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, far more intricate and complex than any he had seen before. The room itself seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, the very air vibrating with power. In the center of the room stood a massive stone pedestal, upon which rested a large, glowing crystal. The man felt drawn to it, unable to resist the pull. His heart thudded in his chest as he stepped forward, reaching out to touch the crystal. As his fingers brushed against its surface, a shock of energy surged through him, causing him to stagger back. The crystal seemed to respond to his touch, its glow intensifying, bathing the entire chamber in a blinding light. And then, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once spoke. You have come to the heart of the desert, where all things are born and where all things return. You have awakened the ancient power, and now you must choose. The man's breath caught in his throat. Choose? He repeated, his voice shaky. What do you mean? What do I have to choose? The voice did not answer directly. Instead, it spoke again. The desert has claimed you, and now it offers you a choice. You may leave this place, return to the world above, free to live your life as you see fit. Or you may stay, become part of the desert's eternal cycle, its guardian and protector. The choice is yours. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their implications. The man's mind raced. What did it mean to become part of the desert's cycle? What did it mean to be a guardian? And if he chose to leave, what would happen to the desert, to the creatures, to the ancient power that had been awakened? He glanced down at the cloth in his hand, its glow now fading, as if waiting for his decision. The crystal pulsed with an energy that seemed to call to him, pulling at his very soul. But the weight of the choice felt unbearable. He could feel the desert's power around him, could feel the ancient energy flowing through his veins, urging him to stay, to take up the mantle that had been placed before him. But then he thought of the world above, the world he had come from. The people he had left behind, the life he had known. Was he willing to give all of that up for something he couldn't even fully understand? The man closed his eyes, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. But in the end, he knew what he had to do. He had already crossed the line. There was no going back. "I choose to stay," he said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. The chamber seemed to respond to his decision, the walls shaking as the crystal's light exploded outward. The ground beneath him rumbled, and for a brief moment, he thought he might be consumed by the force. But then, the light faded, and the room was still once more. The pedestal, the crystal, and the symbols on the walls, all of it seemed to have receded into the background, as if acknowledging his choice. And then, a deep sense of peace washed over him. The desert had claimed him, yes, but it had also accepted him. He was no longer an outsider, no longer a stranger to its ways. He had become part of its eternal rhythm, part of its ancient power. As he turned to leave the chamber, a strange calm settled over him. The desert, with all its mysteries, would always be a part of him. He was its protector now, its guardian, its eternal witness. And though the world above might have forgotten him, the desert never would. He stepped back into the passageway, the glow from the cloth dimming as the walls closed behind him. The desert had claimed its new guardian. And its cycle would continue. Forever.